Hi, everybody. So things happen, and as it so happens, the recording for the previous session vanished into the ether. And so I'm here to record a synopsis of the previous session to walk through our assignment and try to hit on everything that we talked about in this last session. So let me go ahead and just share the old slideshow. So, chapter 2, well, part 2, I should say, chapters 9 to 15. At the end of the first part, the city of Oran was locked. The people were condemned to stay inside of Oran from that point forward. And that's where we pick up in this next part. From now on, it can be said that the plague was the concern of all of us. So it's shifting slowly but surely from a private concern of individuals to a concern of everyone, of all the people of Iran. Now, I have encouraged you to think about ways that the plague is similar to what is happening to us in our time, as well as how our situation is dissimilar. And one way, aside from the severity of the plague in the novel, one way that our situation differs pretty significantly is the fact that ours is a global epidemic. Oran is one town, and they are, let's say, exiled from the world at large, in a way. Now, even if we're in a global pandemic, we can still feel like we're exiled, even if we're not cast out of the world. I mean, where can we be exiled? Into space? No, but we can still feel exiled from the world as a kind of concept, I suppose. In any case, people were now trapped in Iran. Many people, well, some people tried to get out. There was some lawlessness described in the book. In fact, it said the spirit of lawlessness stalked the land or something along those lines. It was even forbidden for letters to be sent out because of the concern for spreading the plague through paper. The use of the phones was even limited. And it's kind of funny because so you may have noticed from some of the previous sessions that I'm kind of a cinephile. And there's this thing that happens in a lot of horror movies, the problem of phones, especially now that we all have mobile phone mobile phones. So there's always this question, why don't they just call the police? And, in those films, there's always a sort of like, oh, no, we don't have a signal out here, or, oh, no, I smashed my phone, to answer the question of the phone. This thing here seems like Camus is doing that, answering the question of the phone. Why don't people just call? It says, well, because the phones produced crowds where people were waiting to use the phone, and so the phone use was also restricted to marriages, births, and deaths, I think is what it said. People were allowed to send out telegrams, 10 words or less. So here we come back to that theme of the insufficiency of language. So people were, having to think of ways to express the feelings that they were having in 10 words or less. As in this example. The example that's given in the book is, am well, always thinking of you, love. So they were just thinking of clever ways, I suppose. Actually, I think it's mentioned the use of stock phrases and how they're just that they're not effective in getting out the remorse and the love that one feels for someone from whom they are separated. I mean, these guys didn't even have emojis. So yeah, what else? How did people behave on being exiled? Well, we get quite some few examples in the story of people kind of reversing course in their attitudes, which is what we see, for example, in the character of Cotard, where he becomes amiable. Apparently, he becomes friendly and starts going out and tipping well and so on. Although you should always keep in mind that he seems to have ulterior motives. Do these other people have ulterior motives? Some of the examples from the story: husbands who had complete faith in their wives found, to their surprise, that they were jealous. Lovers had the same experience. Men who had pictured themselves as Don Juans became, excuse me. We'll get back to that in a second. As Don Juans became models of fidelity. Sons who had lived beside their mothers, hardly giving them a glance, fell to picturing with poignant regret each wrinkle in the absent face that memory cast upon the screen. So people are sensing that, perhaps are sensing that their future is not promised them, which was, of course, always the case. So it tended to bring out a 180-degree turn. In a discussion on people communicating with each other, it says, then it dawned on the man, so the man is talking to another man, this is just a general description, that he and the man with him weren't talking about the same thing. For while he himself spoke from the depths of long days of brooding upon his personal distress, and the image he had tried to impart had been slowly shaped and proved in the fires of passion and regret. So there's a lot about people brooding and sort of stewing in their regrets about their past. This meant nothing to the man to whom he was speaking, who pictured a conventional emotion, a grief that is traded on the marketplace, mass-produced. So the listener doesn't recognize all of the passion that went into forging those words. He only sees grief that is traded on the marketplace, mass-produced. So this is kind of like perhaps a reference to the, pre-plague Iran, where interactions seem to be sort of very shallow and based around conducting business, transactional relations between people, where all of their interactions are just part of a machine. People in the story are living in these memories feeling all kinds of regrets. And they're almost like the living dead. They can't think about the future without being wounded by the eventual realization that, what am I doing thinking about the future? There's no point in doing so. It's certainly not guaranteed to me now. So they're sort of tortured. It's like a hell. Thus, in a middle course between these heights and depths, so they might think back on a fond memory, which of course plunges them into remorse eventually. The heights and depths, they drifted through life rather than lived, the prey of aimless days and sterile memories, like wandering shadows that could have acquired substance only by consenting to root themselves in the solid earth of their distress. So here we're getting that idea that in order to face this, an individual must plant him or herself in the now and just face the situation squarely. That's the only way that their shadows could have acquired substance. Okay. So people were in denial. As this popped up a few moments ago. Yeah, people have been unable to accept what's happening, and they avoid it at all costs. They avoid facing the reality of their situation. The weather again makes an appearance. You'll have to pardon me, I'm kind of losing my voice a little bit. A burst of sunshine was enough to make them seem delighted with the world, while rainy days gave a dark cast to their faces and their mood. A few weeks before, they had been free of this absurd subservience to the weather because they had not to face life alone. The person they were living with held, to some extent, the foreground of their little world. But from now on, it was different. They seemed at the mercy of the sky's caprices. In other words, suffered and hoped irrationally. There it is. The irrational weather, the irrational universe. The weather makes them into objects pushed around like chess pieces, rather than acting of their own free will. They're sort of acting out the universe, acting out the weather. There's mention specifically of parted lovers. So we know that Raymond is one of them, and we know that Ryu is one of them, well, one half of a pair, separated, if you'll recall. Ryu's wife is at the sanatorium being treated for, I think, tuberculosis. I can't remember. Pretty sure that's it. We get a bit of a hint here. Of course, we already know who the narrator is, but to come at last, more specifically to the case of parted lovers who present the greatest interest and of whom the narrator is perhaps better qualified to speak. Their minds were the prey of different emotions, notably remorse. It says ironically that parted lovers were kind of shielded from the horror, the real horror of the situation, by the remorse that they felt for their missing lover. So an irony there. So there's some mention of the overturned carts and the empty marketplaces and nothing really happening as far as business. In spite of such unusual sights, our townfolk apparently found it hard to grasp what was happening to them. There were feelings all could share, such as fear and separation, but personal interests too continued to occupy the foreground of their thoughts. Nobody as yet had really acknowledged to himself what the disease connoted. So it's denial, as I mentioned earlier. Thus, the bare statement that 302 deaths had taken place in the third week failed to strike their imagination. The numbers are not doing it. The numbers are faceless abstractions and do not sufficiently shock them to motivate them to face the situation. Here's something that I'm sure everybody watching can remember. Cases of this happening in our current situation. One of the cafes had the brilliant idea of putting up the slogan, "The best protection against infection is a bottle of good wine," which confirmed an already prevalent opinion that alcohol is a safeguard against infectious disease. So there were stories like this all over the place. People saying that alcohol can protect you, including in the US, those kids who went to spring break. They were like, we've planned this for too long. The beer will protect us. And of course, here in Serbia, we heard stories of rakia, as usual, being the cure for everything. Okay, Raymond comes to visit Ryu. And he has the idea of getting out of town. He says, but confound it, I don't belong here. He's just visiting. He's one of a couple of visitors. If you recall, Teru is also a visitor. For those who don't remember, Raymond is the journalist who wanted to get a story about the state of things for the Arab population. And Ryu said, oh, are you going to print everything I say? Because you might not like it. And Raymond chickened out, as they say. He's like, I don't know if I can just print whatever you say within limits. So he winds up trapped as the city is locked down and he's trying to get out. He's recently married and he's trying to get from Algeria to Paris. Now, this, I'll just remind you, is the inverse of Camus himself, who wound up trapped in France as the Nazis took over. And he was also newly married, recently married, and was trying to get back to Algeria. But the Nazis extended their control to the entirety of France to cover the southern coast. They were worried about being flanked by the Allies from North Africa. And so at that point, Camus could no longer leave France. And then he joined the resistance. So Raymond is moving in the opposite direction, also trying to get back to his new wife. He says, it's so damn silly, doctor, isn't it? The truth is I wasn't brought into the world to write newspaper articles, but it's quite likely I was brought into the world to live with a woman. That's reasonable enough, isn't it? This goes perhaps to one of the disagreements that Camus would have with Sartre, for example. This is a kind of essentialist statement, meaning that it's saying that there's a reason I'm ascribing to myself for being brought into the world, or possible reason. It's quite likely I was brought into the world to live with a woman. And Ryu even concedes that. He says maybe there's something to that. But Raymond wants a certificate that says he doesn't have the disease. I wanted to know whether you couldn't possibly give me a certificate stating I haven't got this damn disease. It might make things easier, I think. Ryu tells him the idea that he doesn't belong here is not a sufficient reason. Oh, I know it's an absurd situation, but we're all involved in it, and we've got to accept it as it is. But I don't belong here. Unfortunately, from now on, you'll belong here like everyone else. Okay. And so there you have it. He's not going to give him a certificate that might not even be good for the entire day. I mean, he could catch he could catch the plague at any given time. So even giving him a certificate, even if it were true that he's not infected, which is not stated either way here, there's no guarantee that he would stay uninfected. Raymond says, you'll soon be talking about the interests of the general public, but public welfare is merely the sum total of private welfares of each of us. This is Raymond's current worldview. It bears mentioning that Ryu responds by saying, you're missing something if you think that the whole of public good is merely the sum total of all the private good. It's that whole, what is a society? You can think of Margaret Thatcher. There is no society, she would say, in fact did say. There are just individuals. That's kind of what's being expressed here. But, well, we'll see how Raymond bears that out. Okay. I just want to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. I mean, of course, there are tons of things. We can't get to every single thing in the book, but it's different doing this by myself without anyone to bounce ideas off of. So, yeah, okay. He says there is no public good. There are just private welfares combined. That's the public good. Okay, so there's talk of Father Panelu. The news of his sermon gets out before the sermon is even conducted. There are rumors about the sermon, and people are feeling conspicuously bereft and desperate. And so, of course, the sermon draws a large crowd. And Father Panelu, well, he doesn't disappoint. He comes out and he starts right out with the hits. No opening act, just Father Panelu. Comes out and says, "Calamity has come upon you, my brethren, and my brethren, you deserved it." There was a flutter that extended to the crowd massed in the rain, of course, outside the porch. Okay, so this is something that happens periodically that in our current our current world that some terrible thing happens and someone ascribes guilt to the victims of, say, a hurricane or a tornado. So yeah, he says you deserve it. You're guilty is what he's telling the people. It says, thus from the dawn of recorded history, the scourge, by the way, for my English learners, a scourge is a whip. The scourge of God has humbled the proud of heart, and laid low those who hardened themselves against him. Ponder this well, my friends, and fall on your knees. In the story, the scene is described as people wide-eyed, listening, watching Father Panelu, and some of them unthinkingly fall to their knees while they're listening at this part. It's very cinematic, as I've pictured the scene in my head. You believed some brief formalities, some bendings of the knee would recompense him well enough for your criminal indifference, but God is not mocked. These brief encounters could not sate is satisfy, the fierce hunger of his love. The fierce hunger of his love. He wished to see you longer and more often, and he wants to know who keeps sending you those SMSs. That is his manner of loving, and indeed, it's the only manner of loving. The only manner of loving. Oh, wow. Okay. God requires much attention. Otherwise, you're going to get the whip. So yeah, Father Panelus sees the plague as driving people towards grace. He sees it as bringing out the possibility of redemption, reminding people of their need for commitment to God. It reveals the will of God in action, unfailingly transforming evil into good. And once again, today is leading us to the dark valley of fears and groans toward the holy silence. Remember the silence here. It's going to come up again. The silence here is the wellspring of all life. So, the punishment is a good thing. In fact, it's the redeeming force. Monsieur Othan, just to remind you, is the police magistrate. We've met him a few times in the story. We've met him on the train platform at the beginning of the book, saying that, oh, these rats, no big deal. We also meet him in Taru's diary. He's the one dining with his wife and his children, who are described as poodles. So he assures Dr. Ryu that he found the preacher's arguments absolutely irrefutable. That's actually true. There's no way to refute any of these arguments. Whatever you might think of them, you certainly couldn't refute them. But not everyone took so unqualified a view. To some, the sermon simply brought home the fact they had been sentenced for an unknown crime to an indeterminate period of punishment. This concept of general guilt, you'll find in other existentialist writers. Kafka, for example, has a lot of themes of guilt. You're guilty. Sartre as well. Not guilty, you're responsible. That's the thing. The radical nature of human freedom is such that not only are you responsible for all the decisions that you make and everything that you are, you're responsible for everything that you are not. So there is this, you can't be everything. And so you can't not be responsible for everything that you're not. You cannot be everything at once. So you're guilty, quote unquote. Okay, so we've heard mention several times in the story of Joseph's book that he's working on, that he often mentions very quickly before scuttling off, as if he's trying to keep it somewhat a secret. He desperately wants to share it with someone, though, deep down, as we'll see here. When we finally get to see what he's been working on, I'll also remind you of the characteristic of Joseph in which he is unable to find the right words to speak. He is trying to improve his Latin. He often uses hackneyed stock phrases and claims that they come from his part of the world. It's pretty amusing. It's charming in a way. I think it's charming anyhow. And yeah, that this also relates to the fact about the telegraphs and how difficult it is to express such things in so few words. So I had to include this GIF. For those of you unfamiliar with this, it's a reference to The Shining, which is, well, in my opinion, one of the great horror movies. The villain, Jack Torrance, he goes with his family to a large hotel that's situated in the mountains to be the caretaker for the winter. So it's a very creepy setting, huge empty hotel with just he, his son, and his wife, staying there while he works on his book. He's typing all day. He says, "Don't disturb me when I'm working." His wife eventually winds up going in there to see what he's been working on, and he's been typing the same sentence over and over again. "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." Monsieur Grand is not so sinister. He talks about torturing himself on even a single word for weeks on end. Evenings, whole weeks spent on one word, just think. Sometimes on a mere conjunction. For those who don't recall, those are and, but, so. He talks about having a hard time choosing between and then. And I don't know, I was kind of mentally going through that and saying, how would you have a hard time choosing between and then? But never mind. I guess I can come up with a couple of situations. But it doesn't seem like it should be such a torture. Here's the sentence. I love the scene too because Ryu sits down and closes his eyes. You know, he's ready to absorb this thing that he's heard so much about by now. And he's like, all right, hit me. Let's hear it. One fine morning in the month of May, an elegant young horsewoman might have been seen riding a handsome sorrel mare across the flowery avenues of the Bois de Boulogne. And Ryu's like, okay, go on. I'd like to hear more. And he's, well, that's, it's a rough draft. It still has a lot to go. By the way, if anybody ever asks you for advice writing something, the first thing you would tell them, especially in this situation, is get rid of all those adjectives. It's a bit unwieldy. He says that's only a rough draft. Once I've succeeded in rendering perfectly the picture in my mind's eye, once my words have the exact tempo of this ride, the horse is trotting 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. See what I mean? The rest will come more easily. And what's more important, the illusion will be such that from the very first words, it will be possible to say, hats off. He imagines the publisher receiving the manuscript and instructing everyone in the publishing office to stand up and say, hats off, or take their hats off. Here we have encountered a master. It's an interesting thing here. It sounds as if the rhythm of the horse should be like the starting of an engine that will continue mechanically through. If he can just get the rhythm right, the 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, the rest will just come out, right? It'll come out like the mighty oak from the acorn. He just has to get the acorn perfect. It's almost as if this sentence is the seed that contains the entire story tied up inside of it. So there's, again, this almost mechanical thing being described. When thinking about the sentence, it says, for though it sometimes satisfied him, he was fully aware it didn't quite hit the mark as yet. And also that to some extent it had a facility of tone, an ease of tone, approximating remotely perhaps, but recognizably the commonplace. Yeah. It's a funny scene. I really, again, I could see it. I could see it in cinematic format in my head as playing very well. I think it's good. It's funny, and of course, we move on quickly from that as things are getting worse in town. By the way, you've probably heard this saying before. Do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. This is not from the book, but this is an example. The perfect being the enemy of the good is preventing Joseph from continuing his story. He just needs the perfect first line in order to get the rest of the novel written. But he'd be better served to put something out and work on it later so he can get more done. And it's good advice in general. If you have some big task in front of you and you realize you're not going to get it perfect, that's okay. Just get something out on paper if you're writing something, and tinker with it. Get yourself some material to work with and move forward from there. Meanwhile, Raymond continues around town trying to find a way out of Oran. He tells Dr. Ryu about the people he's encountered in trying to get out, and he has named them all. I've kind of put them in bold here. You have the sticklers. A stickler, by the way, if you're not familiar with that term, a stickler is somebody who sticks to small details, is unwilling to make any exceptions. Besides these, there were the consolers. So to console means to offer comfort or condolences, who assured him that the present state of things couldn't possibly last, fobbed him off, like passed him off to someone else, by telling him he was making too much fuss about a passing inconvenience. Then there were the very important persons, who asked the visitor to leave a brief note of his case and said they would decide on it in due course. Okay. The triflers. A trifle is a small, unimportant thing. It's also a dessert in England. And to trifle is to deal in small, unimportant things. So it's also a verb. So yes, they offer him billeting warrants. So that would be like cargo papers. Or gave the addresses of lodgings. The red tape merchants. Red tape, if you haven't heard, is an idiom that stands for bureaucracy. Red tape merchants, bureaucrats. They made him fill up a form and promptly interred it in a file. So he fills out the form and they say thank you, and they put it in a file, and that's that. All done. You have the overworked officials who raise their arms to heaven, the much harassed, so harassed is tormented and abused, officials who simply looked away, and finally the traditionalists. These were the greatest in number, who referred Rambert to another office or recommended some new method of approach. Interesting detail here. The really remarkable thing, and Rambert was greatly struck by this, was the way in which in the midst of a catastrophe, offices could go on functioning serenely, gracefully, and take initiatives of no immediate relevance and often unknown to the highest authority, purely and simply because they had been created originally for this purpose. Okay, this is like, again, sort of a living dead thing. It's still alive. It's still functioning. It's still going through the motions. It's a machine doing what it was designed to do. So even the bureaucracies are continuing to, churn out papers and initiatives as they were designed to do. So after this, the temperature goes way up, and so do the number of deaths. Things are really heating up in Oran. On the day following the unseasonable downpour, unseasonable, see, that's that irrational weather again. This is in reference to Father Panelou's sermon. The unseasonable downpour of that Sunday, summer blazed out above the housetops. First, a strong, scorching wind blew steadily for a whole day, drying up the walls, and then the sun took charge. Incessant waves of heat and light swept the town day long, and but for arcaded streets and the interiors of houses, everything lay naked to the dazzling impact of the light. The sun stalked our townsfolk along every byway. So stalking is hunting. Into every nook, and when they paused, it struck. So the sun is stalking the streets like a tiger. Since this first onslaught of heat, just a sec. Synchronized with a startling increase in the number of victims, there were now nearly 700 deaths a week. A mood of profound discouragement settled on the town. So things are not going well. We get more from Theroux's diary. Oh, and interesting thing here is we get some scenes here in Theroux's diary that we're going to get from Raymond's perspective too later. So we get the same scene from two different perspectives. At first, so we have some information on the man who spits on cats. If you'll recall, there's an irrational figure, an absurd figure, a man who dresses up and goes out and attracts the cats and spits on them and is delighted every time he hits a cat. But now the little old man went on to his balcony at the usual hour, showed some surprise, and leaning on the rail, closely scanned the corners of the street. Could not find any cats. In fact, it says that people had been shooting cats and dogs because they were worried about how the plague was spreading. On the 8th day, Theroux waited for the cat-spitting man. The window stayed resolutely closed on all too comprehensible distress. This entry ends with Theroux summing up, "It is forbidden to spit on cats in plague time." Perfectly normal English sentence there. Yes, it is forbidden to spit on cats in plague time. Should make signs that say so. I mean, it really should always be forbidden, honestly. It's in the thick of calamity, Theroux says in his diary, that one gets hardened to the truth, in other words, to silence. So there's something here about the silence. For Theroux, who recognizes absurdity, and as we find out from other places in the book, is not a believer. The silence is the truth, not in some mystical sense, but that there's just nothing there. There's nothing speaking to you from beyond the world. There's nothing but silence, and that's the truth. For Father Panelou, if you recall, the truth is the wellspring of all life. It's an interesting contrast. On the asthmatic Spaniard, so Theroux goes along with Rieu and meets the crazy Spaniard as portrayed by Dolly in one of my previous slideshows. Here's where we get the details about the peas in the pans. The asthmatic Spaniard tells time using peas. But first, there's this detail about the fact that he decided at 50 years old that he'd done enough work for a lifetime. He decided to go to bed forever. It's an interesting retirement plan. Yeah, he decided he'd done enough work for a lifetime. He took to his bed and never left it again, and not because of the asthma. He just said, I'm going to go to bed and stay there. He tells time, the time to eat anyway, with his 2 saucepans. One was always full of peas when he woke in the morning. He filled the other pea by pea at a constant, carefully regulated speed. Thus for him was reckoned by these pans, thus time for him was reckoned by these pans, and he could take his bearings in at any moment of the day. Every 15 pans, he said, it's feeding time. What could be simpler? Okay. So this is clearly absurd. I mean, you would have to, if you're going to transfer the peas at a regulated speed, you either have to do it constantly enough to achieve a rhythm that could be somewhat constant. Because if you're doing it, say, every 5 minutes, then you're going to have a lot of variation. You're never going to remember 5 minutes, because the elasticity of your subjective experience of time, 5 minutes will not always seem like 5 minutes. So he must be doing it constantly, because 15 pans is a lot of pans. So he must just be counting peas all day. transferring peas all day. And that's what he does. It's like Sisyphus. It's never going to end, apparently, as long as he's alive and eating. And he thinks it's the simplest possible solution. He doesn't like watches and clocks. I think he says they're expensive and something else. He just doesn't trust them. So clearly absurd. Theroux asks of the Spaniard, is he a saint? Strange question, huh? Yes, if saintliness is an aggregate of habits. Now that might sound just ridiculous, but maybe not. I'm reminded of some things from Buddhism, for example. There's a saying that goes, before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. It has to do with habituating yourself. So that's a possible response to absurdity, is to just kind of do the things that you would do to respond appropriately to situations. Now, counting peas is not necessarily proper response to a situation, but the idea of just getting into a rhythm and, well, okay, seeing that as a way of perhaps freeing yourself, at least your inner self, from thinking about it, because eventually you'll just be chopping wood and carrying water. There's another one, it's similar. It's something like, when hungry, eat your rice. When tired, close your eyes. Fools laugh at this, but wise men know what it means. That's also a saying from Buddhism. And it's just about, there's no great mystery is kind of what it's saying. You just do what's appropriate to a situation. Theroux goes on to describe people's behavior from his perspective and how they go out to the cafes, and they are pretty much seeking after enjoyment, faced with the possibility of no future at all. In the early days, when they thought this epidemic was like other epidemics, religion held its ground. But once these people realized their instant peril, they gave their thoughts to pleasure. And all the hideous fears that stamped their faces in the daytime are transformed in the fiery, dusty nightfall into a sort of hectic exaltation, an unkempt freedom fevering their blood. So people are out being hedonistic, right? They're drinking, they're meeting each other, and that's it. And he says of himself, and I too, I'm no different. So Theroux associates himself with that attitude about life, of, seeking after pleasure, or at least avoiding pain. But what matter? Death means nothing to men like me. It's the event that proves them right. So death proves them right in seeking pleasure is the idea. The fact that you will not be able to seek pleasure anymore proves you right to have sought pleasure. Theroux, in the journal, by the way, he talks about meeting with Ryu and admiring Ryu's mother, and we get one side of the meeting from the journal. We get the other side of the meeting from Ryu's perspective. Theroux comes to visit Ryu. He says, in a fortnight, that's 2 weeks, by the way, for those who don't know, or a month at most, you'll serve no purpose here. Things will have got out of hand. I agree, says Ryu. The sanitary department is inefficient and understaffed. Well, understaffed for one thing, and you're worked off your feet. Ryu admitted this was so. So, earlier, Ryu said, orders, what's needed is imagination. And so that's what we have now, where Teru decides to take initiative rather than waiting on the local authorities to do something. He says, it's this I have to say. I've drawn up a plan for voluntary groups of helpers. Get me empowered to try out my plan, and then let's sidetrack officialdom. In other words, distract the local authorities or put them off the scent. In any case, the authorities have their hands more than full already. I have friends in many walks of life. They'll form a nucleus to start from, and of course, I'll take part in it myself. I didn't put the quote here, but Ryu does let him know that, you know, you have a 1 in 3 chance of surviving if you do this. The question of motivations comes up here in the discussion that follows. Ryu is trying to figure out his own motivations. He asks, Teru is trying to figure out his own motivations, not Ryu. He says to Ryu, why do you yourself show such devotion considering that you don't believe in God? I suspect your answer may help me to mine. So in order for him to find his own motivations, he's turning to Ryu for some insight, because he knows also that Ryu is not a believer either. Anyhow, in this respect, Ryu believed himself to be on the right road. In fighting against creation as he found it, that's how Ryu sees his profession, as fighting against creation, fighting against nature. Yeah, that's true. It is natural to die of illnesses. Yeah, Teru says, so that's what you think of your profession? Ryu is unable to come up with a concise answer. He's more or less like, I don't know. He says, I have no idea what's awaiting me or what will happen when all this ends. For the moment, I know this. There are sick people and they need curing. Later on, perhaps, they'll think things over, and so shall I. It's basically, we don't have time to think about this right now. But what's wanted now is to make them well. I defend them as best I can, that's all. Okay. So, yeah, he's like, I don't know. I really don't have time to think about it. It was mentioned by Stefan, one of our students in the discussion, that Teru has time because he's some wealthy guy. So he has time to think about these things, where Ryu is a doctor. He doesn't have time to think about these things. It's a pretty good thing to notice. So yeah, Ryu says, I don't know. I just do what I'm doing. Again, think back to that chop wood, carry water. That's this, you know. You do what's appropriate at the moment. I don't want to say, though, that the solution is I'm just doing my job, because I think that Camus would disagree with that as a defense for things. You may recognize that defense from concentration camp guards. I don't think it's I'm just doing my job. Because then it would simply be, well, if you picked the right profession with the right, I don't know, moral and ethical aims, then just doing your job is the right thing. But if you pick a job with, so I don't think that's it, but I don't know. I'm interested to hear from you guys in the next session on that topic. Yeah. So Teru also comes up with his own idea of what's motivating him, but we'll get to that in a sec. Ryu says, since the order of the world is shaped by death, mightn't it be better for God if we refuse to believe in him and struggle with all our might against death without raising our eyes toward the heaven where he sits in silence? Okay. Taru nods and says, yes, but your victories will never be lasting. That's all. Aha, there it is. So that's, again, a Sisyphean task. You can never win forever. As a doctor, what would that mean? That would mean defeating death. That's what that would mean, which could never happen. So yes, your victories will never be lasting. Ryu's face darkened. Yes, I know that, but it's no reason for giving up the struggle. See, here it is. Struggle, revolt, not taking things lying down. No reason, I agree. Only I now can picture what this plague must mean for you. Yes, a never-ending defeat. So he's saying, you fight. You fight because that's what you do. That's the reason. It's the same. It's very okay. Just once again to call back to those Buddhist sayings about, you know, when hungry, eat your rice. You do the thing appropriate to the situation. Don't worry about the reasons. Is what's going on here, right? The reasons. Who cares? If you try to constantly figure out the reasons for your problems, you'll forget to solve them. Both Ryu and Panalu believe that the plague can bring out the best in people. How do they differ? Well, since you guys aren't here to discuss it with me, Panalu does not believe in fighting, right? He's sort of like, no, this plague is here to lead us to the promised land. You have to kind of accept it. After all, you deserve it. There's not much you can do about that, is Panalu's position, at least at the time of making his sermon. Whereas Ryu believes in revolt against nature as he finds it. Who taught you all this, doctor? Says Taru. The reply came promptly, immediately. Suffering. Suffering is the teacher for Dr. Ryu. You know, suffering would probably be the teacher. Well, okay, well, it's the scourge, I guess, for Panalu as well. The Scourge of God, though. It's wielded by God. Ryu asks Taru, do you really imagine you know everything about life? And Taru's like, yeah, I do. He's very confident. He's seen it all, apparently. He's a man of the world. I don't recall that it says where he got his money in the book. He's just a guy who's staying at the nice hotel in town. So like we said before, he's a visitor. So we get this impression that he's a man of the world, as they say. Out with it, Taru. What on earth prompted you to take a hand in this? My code of morals, perhaps, he says. Your code of morals? What code? Comprehension. Okay, so comprehension is his code of morals. The fact that he understands people and understands the world is the code of morals that he offers up. Is it hubris? Is it a bit prideful, perhaps, to say that you understand everything about life? Maybe. I would be a bit more humble, but, you know, it's up for discussion. And yeah, that's the end of chapter 15. We're sticking with approximately 60 pages per session. That puts us, for the next session, up through chapter 19. So part 3 is pretty short, so you're going to get through it entirely for the next session. Chapter 19 is the first chapter of part 4. So you're just reading the first chapter of part 4. And I'm telling you that because the chapters aren't numbered in the book. You can look in the study guide to figure out the chapter number, but if you don't want to try to figure out which one matches up by the description, then I'm letting you know. It's the first chapter. Sorry, yeah, the first chapter of part 4. Okay, well, normally I would ask if you had any questions or comments, but you're not here. So I hope that you guys join us for the next session. A lot of you were not able to make it this last time. I suspect it's because of the weather. How about that? It starts raining, people stop showing up to reading groups. Don't be pushed around like an object by the rain. You know, it doesn't rain inside at your computer or mobile device, right? Okay, so until next time, see you guys.